Okay, well, thank you very much, James, and all of the colleagues from the Brunel South Asia Research Group. I think this is a really timely and important discussion to be having at this point. Just to sort of say a little bit more about myself and South Asia Solidarity Group, which I've been a member of for several decades now. I mean, personally, I work in international development. That's the area of my research, with a focus on South Asia and particularly India. A lot of my early research was in Bihar, and more recently I've also been doing some work on Nepal. But I'm really here to talk about the work which we do in South Asia Solidarity Group, which has been involved, as I said, over many years in building awareness and support for people's movements for justice, against communalism, people's movements against things like land grab, and for basic democratic rights and human rights. But having said that, we also have a long history of supporting South Asian workers' struggles, and particularly South Asian women workers' struggles here in Britain. And in fact, one of the strikes which we are very heavily involved with, and my colleague Sarojit Johal is here, who was very centrally involved in that, was of the workers at the Hillingdon Hospital just up the road from here. So from 1995 to 2000, South Asian women workers at Hillingdon Hospital, who were cleaners and ancillary staff, were on strike after having been sacked essentially and told that they would be, their conditions would be dramatically worsened. So 56 workers were on strike for 5 years. And they actually won, and in 2000 they were brought back, with all of their conditions intact, and they basically won a huge victory. And those women were from different backgrounds. They were all Asian almost, but they were all from different religious and geographical backgrounds. So I just want to say that and there were a number of these kinds of strikes over the years. I'm sure you've all heard of the Grunwick strike. In Leicester itself, there was the very iconic Imperial Typewriters strike back in 1974, where, both Hindu and Muslim workers were involved, right? So, in a way, what I want to say is that in the past, what we've seen is not just a question of harmony. It's not just a question, we've heard a lot recently from Leicester about how there's been harmony between the Hindu and Muslim communities till now. But this wasn't just a question of harmony. It was really a question of unity in practice in the context of shared struggles. So what we've seen over time is a change in identity, where religion becomes the most important way that people identify and organize. And within that, you can then think about, well, is there going to be harmony or is there going to be conflict? And one of the things I want to highlight, I'm going to talk in a moment a bit more about the role of Hindutva, which has already been mentioned. But I think we also need to look at the role of the British state. Because one of the ways that the British state, as we know, responded to all of the very militant struggles which went on within Asian communities, and the kinds of resistance that was built to racism, alongside, of course, African Caribbean communities. One of the responses to that was the strategy of multiculturalism, where people were encouraged increasingly to sort of identify much more with particular communities, with particular kind of being siloed into those countries of origin. And then increasingly in the 90s, it became about faith communities. And under New Labour, this was very much the framing. that this was how people would access resources and get funding as community organizations and so on. And of course that coincided very much with the global war on terror and with the rise of Islamophobia as something which I think we need to see as absolutely central to British racism certainly from that point on. So of course, that period then became also the period when groups aligned with Hindu supremacists in India were able to really establish themselves as community organizations in Britain. Of course, that's not when they began. So groups like the Vishwa Hindu Parishad and the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh have a long history in the UK, and interestingly, the first branch of the VHP was actually formed in Leicester in 1979. But from the 90s onwards, they expanded a great deal, using state funding for things like shakhas, which were kind of, they can be interpreted as cells, but they were basically small groups which used places like secondary schools with council funding to have, to train young people and so on. And we've seen, the kinds of training which was given, some of you may have seen, there was an ITV documentary a few years back about one in West London, where they had like a summer school for school children, where they were really telling them that Hindus and Muslims are not just separate, but that Muslims are the enemies of Hindus and also Christians. So that very, very, acutely communal ideology was being spread in this way. And the other aspect, of course, of the united struggles, which I talked about at the beginning, was, of course, against the fascists and the far right, the white supremacists on the street. And that was another kind of arena where you saw people very much coming together for many decades after communities became established here. But what we see now, of course, is that there are white fascists, members of far-right groups allegedly joining the march through Leicester where Jai Shri Ram was shouted. What we see now is someone like Tommy Robinson, the notorious racist and Islamophobe, giving interviews to a far-right portal in India about how Hindu communities need to be protected, and retweeting fake news about attacks being planned in Wembley on temples, which were completely fabricated. So how did this happen? I mean, I think we need to look at that in a bit more detail, because it's not simply a matter of sort of having a common perceived enemy or some sort of tactical alliance. I think we need to remember that when we talk about fascism in the context of the Hindu right, or the Hindu supremacists, as I would call them, it's not just a kind of rhetorical use of the word. We have to remember that their roots are very much in the 1920s, when the RSS was set up, actually modeled on Mussolini's black shirts. We have to remember that one of the leading Hindutva ideologues, M.S. Golwalkar, was an admirer of Hitler and the policies of Nazi Germany, which he described as the height of race pride, which India would do well to emulate. And then the other point, I want to make 3 points really about the nature of Hindutva. The second one is that I think we have to understand it as a phenomenon which is deeply colonial. So if we look at the roots of these ideas about the whole of Indian history being a history of conflict between Hindus and invading Muslims, we can see that this is something that the British deliberately, and they wrote about this, deliberately started to build after 1857, because 1857 there was a huge uprising across a vast area in which Hindus and Muslims were seen to be working together, and where the British came very close to having to being thrown out of India. So after that, there was a very concerted attempt to develop this narrative that of division. And that same narrative is the one which has been promoted extensively by the Hindu right. And we also see the fact that they were never really particularly involved in the independence struggle because, again, they always saw the primary enemy to be not the British, but Muslims. And the third point that I want to make about how we characterize Hindu supremacism is the fact that now it is completely enmeshed with neoliberal corporate capitalism. And I think that's important because sometimes it's referred to as Hindu nationalism, right? But there is nothing nationalist about the economic policies of the Modi government or of Hindutva itself. It's very much about promoting, in fact, another round of plunder of India in which corporate capital is basically all the restrictions on it, whether it's labor laws or environmental regulations, are removed. And we saw some of those battles playing out in the recent farmers' movement that some of us were talking about before we started. So finally, I just want to say that it's really important, I think, to remember these 3 points about fascism, about the colonial nature of Hindutva, and about its inextricability from corporate capital. When we encounter the way in which Hindu supremacists try and present themselves, particularly in academic circles. Because we're seeing a lot recently about, we're seeing a lot of scholars aligned with Hindutva presenting themselves as decolonial, right? And I don't know if some of you probably remember that quite recently we saw Walter Mignolo, who's one of the leading Latin American scholars of decoloniality, actually endorsing a book by a Hindu supremacist, which, you know, the book was claiming to be all about kind of rejecting Western thought and so on. But it was actually all of the Hindu right agenda of attacking Muslim and Christian minorities and dismantling the constitution from the perspective that the rights enshrined in the India's constitution were not, in fact, inherently Indian. So I think we have to be very wary then of these sorts of framings. And this framing in Britain has been very closely linked to the denial of the existence of caste, which is the other thing that I think really has to be touched upon in any discussion of Hindutva in Britain, where caste comes to be claimed as being a British invention, despite its 3,000-year-old history. And this is something which has become a very key battleground in Britain because of the fact that Dalit organizations have organized over a very long period to get legislation which would allow caste discrimination to be incorporated in equalities law. Because we know that there's very pervasive caste discrimination, not only in Hindu communities, but across South Asian communities in Britain. But with Hindutva, you have this now outright denial of the existence of caste. And in fact, Satish Sharma, who is one of the very vocal representatives of this ideology in Britain and heads the National Council of Hindu Temples, actually went on record saying that to speak of caste to a Hindu is a slur equivalent to using the N-word. So to actually mention caste to someone who's Hindu. So this is the level of denialism which we have to be aware of. And the other thing which of course is really important at the moment is this term Hinduphobia, which is circulating a lot after Leicester. We're seeing a lot of, we're seeing it being taken on, we're seeing it being mentioned by Keir Starmer in the Diwali message and all kinds of places. We're seeing protests against the BBC where it's mentioned. But again, it's not as recent as one might think. Some of our members in South Asia Solidarity Group were actually present at a meeting in the House of Commons, chaired by the Conservative MP Bob Blackman and the Tory party donor Lord Jitesh Gadhia, where they hosted Gideon Falter of the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which was very much instrumental in establishing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which many progressive Jewish groups and others have pointed out makes criticism of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, brings that within the definition of anti-Semitism. And the people at this meeting were basically saying to Gideon Falter, please teach us how you did this, because we need to do something very similar with Hinduphobia. And now we're seeing, in fact, in the recent protests which they held at the BBC, that it's not just Hinduphobia that's being mentioned, it's Indiaphobia. So any criticism of the Indian regime then comes within a framework which they want to represent as a type of racism, essentially. I think we also need to mention at this point that there's despite the parallels and the similarities in strategies, there's a key difference, because unlike anti-Semitism and unlike Islamophobia and other forms of racism, Hindutva does not have a global historical or material basis. But what we are seeing at the moment is that accusations of Hinduphobia are accompanied by abuse and attacks really directed at anyone critical of either of Hindu supremacist ideas or of Indian government policies. So I'm going to leave it there and look forward to